Welcome to MindTricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with Dr. Kevin Pelletier, an associate professor of English and a distinguished educator at the University of Richmond. He has published articles and an academic monograph on 19th century U.S. religious culture, race and slavery, abolitionist literature, and U.S. intellectual history. He is the author of Apocalyptic Sentimentalism, Love and Fear in the U.S. Antebellum Literature, published in 2015 by the University of Georgia Press. Dr. Pelletier teaches literature courses at the University of Richmond, often drawing from the apocalyptic tradition stemming from early American puritanical beliefs, which has evolved into the post-apocalyptic fiction genre in more modern times. The connection between these early traditions and the meaning of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic literature to the collective human psyche is the subject of our conversation today. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. You know, this concept of post-apocalyptic fiction has been something on my mind recently with my recent publication of my post-apocalyptic novel. And so I've been just really interested in talking with English professors and people who are knowledgeable on the subject to really understand better where the genre came from and why people are interested to begin with. And so I know you are a professor and associate professor of English at the University of Richmond. You've taught some courses on this subject, and you wrote an interesting sounding book, Apocalyptic Sentimentalism, Love and Fear in U.S. Antebellum Literature, which I'd love to hear a little bit about that too. And I know that's probably not specifically post-apocalyptic in nature, but it's on the general subject of the apocalypse. So to begin with, Kevin, tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, why you're interested in this subject as an academic subject that you teach, and also a bit about your book.
Yeah, happy to. First, congratulations on the publication of your novel. That's a very exciting thing that we should celebrate anytime someone publishes something. So I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Thanks so much.
You know, I probably read a lot of apocalyptic fiction before I knew that it was apocalyptic fiction, before I had a designation for it. When I was younger, I read Stephen King's The Stand, and I read science fiction that could be classified as apocalyptic, and some of the early classics from the Cold War nuclear age, just when I was a younger reader. But it wasn't until I was a first year graduate student getting my PhD that I started to discover that this was part of a larger tradition, and it was potentially a really interesting tradition to think about. So what happened was, in the span of a week, I had seen on PBS, they were showing a documentary on global diseases, and this is well before COVID, but they were talking about what it means to sort of track diseases and thinking about pandemics and these sorts of things, and they used the term apocalyptic. I had also watched an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. My wife and I were huge fans of that show, and she used the term apocalyptic. And also that week, I was reading two works of fiction, one work of fiction, one work of sort of political rhetoric from the 19th century. The first was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harry Beecher Stowe, and the second was The Appeal by David Walker. David Walker was a Boston radical abolitionist from 1829. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1850-51. And both of those works could quite easily be characterized as apocalyptic. So I just thought it was strange, that there was a documentary about disease, a popular television show, and these two really important works of abolition, anti-slavery thinking that were all utilizing the same kind of framework. So I knew something was up, but I didn't know why, and I didn't quite know how to think about it. So I began thinking about it in very modest ways, thinking about what's the relationship abolition has to this weird sort of end of the world thinking. And it wasn't until I took a seminar on the New England Puritans when everything changed for
Huh.
me. I realized, like, whoa, this is not the apocalyptic tradition in US literary history is not some marginal or like kind of peripheral, somewhat weirdly idiosyncratic tradition. It is foundational because the first apocalyptic writers were the Puritans. If you read their poetry, if you read their journals and diaries, if you read certainly their sermons, they are always meditating on second coming, the end of days, God's wrath and retribution, what's called broadly eschatology, a preoccupation with the end times.
Huh.
And that changed everything because I realized like this was foundational to, on the one hand, like a literary tradition that I was interested in, but also to a certain kind of thinking that I would associate as being characteristically American ever since the early Puritans, like 1620. There hasn't been a period in US literary history where apocalyptic writing hasn't been prominent. So that's how I became really interested in the tradition, and I've been thinking about it ever since.
Yeah, and how about this book that you wrote?
For like my academic work, I had to be I had to have a particular focus, be somewhat specialized. And so I became very interested in the relationship between a series of like intellectual and literary forces that were happening in the decades leading up to the Civil War. One was abolition. The other was a rapidly changing religious landscape in the United States, coming out of Calvinism, coming out of Puritanism. And the other was the tradition of sentimentalism, sentimental writing, writing that was dominated by female writers, though not exclusively, writing that was eminently preoccupied with emotion and feeling as being the most central thing in constructing a moral nation. And a lot of the conversation around the sentimental tradition, which then gets tied to abolition, because this becomes the foundation for a certain moral response to slavery. A lot of the discourse around sentimentalism, both in the 19th century, but by scholars, was that when sentimental writers were talking about feeling, they were really talking about compassion and love and sympathy, which is true. You know, if you feel right, this is what Harry Beecher Stowe says, you'll have a properly moral response, a properly Christian response to slavery. So the enslavers who are also Christian, the problem is they're not really feeling right in relationship to the enslaved population. What I also discovered, though, and this hadn't been talked about in really any of the scholarship in any meaningful way, is that this tradition of sentimentalism, which was tied to love and compassion, was also deeply preoccupied with warnings of God's wrath, God's retribution, terror, vengeance, hellfire, brimstone, all of the things we
Yeah.
associate with a kind of end of the world logic. And it was the relationship between all of those forces that that book really concentrates on. So I talk about writers like Nat Turner and David Walker. These were sort of insurrectionary figures. They're not typically treated as sentimental figures, but they're deeply invested in how fear and terror can incite a moral response to slavery. I talk about John Brown. John Brown, if you know people talk about John Brown, you know, he initiates this raid on Harper's Ferry, a really controversial figure in the late 1850s and still today. But if you read his letters, if you read his, you know, his trial transcript, he's deeply motivated by love and compassion. But he also has deep faith in a righteous, vengeful God who will redress America's greatest sin. So all of these things are sort of in play with one another, and that became my academic work. Now my reading interest is much more capacious. I mean, I've been reading from the Puritans all the way to the contemporary moment. I'm still very invested in a sweeping tradition, much more than a narrowly academic one.
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating stuff, Kevin. And we're going to dig a little bit more into some of this with some of the questions I want to ask you later as well, because it's very interesting. But if I'm understanding correctly, sentimentalism has to do with feelings and emotions, and apocalypse, it sounds to me like the way that you're talking about it in the antebellum period and early American history has to do with morality and morals and ethical behavior and how people were, how politics and how the culture was shaping up, especially around the abolitionist movement and kind of the merging of those two things and how they affected one another. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, absolutely spot on. I mean, the question for the abolitionist is the question the Puritans had. Like, how do you ensure that Americans, that citizens are acting morally? I
Hmm.
mean, you can tell them to be compassionate. You can insist that they be good, but sometimes that's not enough. The thing that incentivizes right action, moral behavior is oftentimes with abolitionists, and I would also say Puritans as well. If you read a lot of Puritan sermons, you see this sort of structure in place, lots of warnings about God's wrath
Hmm.
in order to make the congregants better, more just and righteous people. And so I was really interested in the way abolition leveraged this dynamic. It wasn't enough to insist that God is love, and so therefore one should also be loving. There's the great sort of scriptural passages of walking in the fear of the Lord. I think that's quite literal for a lot of early Christians, that fear is an essential component. It's sort of the check that makes sure that your moral imagination is pointed in the right direction. And so the abolitionists, the Puritans, who were dealing with like deeply divisive and incendiary political issues, were trying to find a way of ensuring that people were making these moral decisions. And I think fear and terror of God's wrath, of damnation, of hellfire were essential parts of that rhetorical structure and disposition.
Well, okay, so apocalyptic stories and discussion revolved around that earlier, and now we've evolved into zombies and alien invasions and all sorts of other forms of apocalypse, which I'm assuming were not the focus back then as much. Gosh, there's so many directions I want to go with this conversation with you to learn more about it. But let's talk about that evolution a little bit. Did the earlier apocalyptic writings and stories evolve into what we have now? Are they connected in some way?
I think they are. I think it requires, and I can be efficient about this. I can tell you what I think happened. Like, how do you get to like a quite literal for the Puritans? This is not a metaphorical or literary. They don't think of themselves as producing a literature. They think of themselves as deeply engaged with a theological and providential project. This is not zombies as a metaphor for something. It's quite urgent and quite real. How do you get from that to what you're talking about,
Yeah, basically post-apocalyptic fiction for entertainment
Yeah,
purposes, but we're assuming there's something a lot deeper there to it. Otherwise, it
right.
wouldn't resonate with people. Yeah.
I think what happens, and I think when that happens, is the same period I'm talking about. This is why I was quite interested in the decades leading up to the Civil War. It's during this period where writers, and I think some of it has to do with the Industrial Revolution and the ability to mass produce books. So suddenly, someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne, he could be a professional writer. He could actually make enough money to tell stories and support himself financially, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's in the 1830s and 40s with writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, where they're still using apocalyptic motifs, apocalyptic imagery, apocalyptic themes, but they're not talking about the apocalypse as a strictly theological concern or religious concern. They're using these images and motifs basically to tell stories. So if you read a story like The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, it's chilling, it's deeply gothic and deeply apocalyptic. It's about a pandemic, so it has all of these like resonances with the bubonic plague and all of these sorts of things. He's not interested in making a theological point. He's interested in like scaring the hell out of us. Same thing
He was
with,
good at that.
he was one of the greats. He has another story called A Conversation Between Iros and Charmian. This is such a bizarre story where these two people are having a conversation, but they're dead and they're in heaven. And they're having a conversation about what happened, and what we learn happened in this story. It's only 6 or 7 pages, is that a comet entered the Earth's atmosphere and basically removed all the oxygen and killed everything. So it's like comet literature. This is like Melancholia or Armageddon or all of these sort of like cinematic versions we have of the same kind of storytelling. They're peripheral now because we don't talk about these books. There were so many books in the period that were about the fall of Rome or the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii or the fall of the Aztecs. All of these pretty popular for the time stories about the decline of civilization, and all of them utilized all of the motifs that were present in Puritan writing, just not the theological anxiety in much the same way. So I think after the middle part of the 19th century, it simply becomes possible to join all of the fear and anxiety and existential dread that the Puritans were brilliant at with a form of entertainment that is going to continue to be more secular, more historically specific, more contemporary. So when we're talking about the zombie tradition is actually quite old, but when we're reading, for example, World War Z or watching World War Z on the big screen, it doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the Puritans because it doesn't. But I would say it's part of a 400-year-old tradition. It's really the way I think about it that is rich and profound, and that I think if you track backwards, you can see all of the links unfolding over time. And I think that's how you get to popular entertainment from this early sort of literary formation.
So, do you think that modern post-apocalyptic stories carry with them some of the same kind of weight that the earlier puritanical stories did about the apocalypse had, except that those were very focused on God and religion and religious practices and judgment and heaven and hell and all of that. I understand that. And the post-apocalyptic literature and genre now doesn't necessarily always focus on that, although I'm sure you could probably find some stories that do. But do you think that the underlying themes there that people are afraid of, the moral messages, so to speak, are just as important now as they were then, just not coming at it from that sort of religious, are we all going to hell type of point of view compared to just sort of a general philosophical morality point of view?
Yeah, I think if the material, if the literature, if the film, if it didn't have these kind of existential dimensions to it, even in the most kind of popcorn type movies and that sort of thing, if the tradition didn't ask or continue to ask these kinds of foundational questions, I don't think it would have lasted as long as it has. I mean, one
Hmm.
of the great things about the tradition is that if you choose a period and then read into it, the 1950s, let's say, and you read Alas Babylon, or you read On the Beach, or you read Level 7, or all the kind of nuclear age, you realize that the writers are asking these deeply existential questions about what it means to live in the wake of atomic energy and the atomic bomb. Even as these narratives are quite entertaining, I think readers continue to return to them. And I think writers continue to rely on them because it's a structure and a discourse and a set of themes and motifs that allows writers to continue to ask pretty profound questions about what it means to be in this world, in the living within the constraints and concerns that we have. And it gives, readers an opportunity to explore these issues in a way that's, most readers of apocalyptic fiction don't have like the same concerns as Puritans living in the 1660s. So of course the content of the apocalypse would change. But I think we have our concerns. I think readers today, my students who are thinking about the climate or thinking about real political instability, these narratives provide an occasion for them to grapple with those fundamental questions that I think they feel like they're confronting. And the tradition becomes a kind of guide, an occasion for them to grapple with these issues in a way that I think is really important and sustaining, even though it can be quite bleak at times.
Yeah, well, and you make a good point because I remember I was around reading things back in the 80s, and a lot of it was about nuclear holocaust and nuclear annihilation, and that was a big theme then. I don't know if you get as many writings and movies now about nuclear war. I mean, it's obviously still a worry and a threat, but it seems like people may be moving on to other types of apocalyptic scenarios, the global warming. Obviously, with COVID-19 recently, there's a lot of viral-based, infection-based types of literature and movies coming out. So I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, Kevin, you talked about the concept of catastrophe and what catastrophe means and reveals about ordinary life. So, how is examining ordinary life and how people are just sort of living their lives and introducing this idea of catastrophe and what it means to ordinary life? Why is that an important central theme to the genre?
I think most people, when they hear apocalyptic lit or apocalyptic film, or whatever the case may be, it's this sort of grandiose end of the world, massive destruction. It's apocalypse is shorthand for destruction and devastation, which is fair and understandable. But if that's all it was, I think readers and viewers of film would grow a bit tired, a bit bored of the tradition because it wouldn't offer more than the spectacle of widespread devastation. So I think of a few of Roland Emmerich's films, 2012 and The Day After Tomorrow, which are really great. They're canonical within the tradition of apocalyptic cinema, but they really are over the top spectacles of devastation. And they're great cinematically for that reason. But I think so much of the tradition uses the apocalypse, uses the anxiety around this sort of devastation to explore issues that have much more to do with everyday life than with like global tsunamis or widespread nuclear holocaust, which are real things that we might be confronting. But a novel like Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, it's about a flu pandemic. This was published, I think, in 2015, so before COVID. It starts off with what's called the Georgian flu, and it's a flu that ultimately decimates the entire planet. So it looks like it's a book about the flu, but it's not really. The book's not really interested at all in the flu. It's interested in like a weird set of issues. One is like celebrity culture. There's an actor who's like a film actor who's like performing Shakespeare. So it's really interested. The book is interested in Shakespeare because Shakespeare is producing some of his best work during when London was like shut down because of the plague. She's interested that that author and that novel are interested in iPhones and technology and all of these things that don't seem to have anything to do with the flu. So the flu becomes this mechanism for her to explore other things that have to do with everyday life, so-called everyday life. I think of another book, On the Beach by Neville Shute. Shute was he was an English writer and eventually immigrated to Australia. He wrote this great Cold War nuclear age apocalyptic novel. And what happens in this novel is in the global north, there's a major nuclear conflict, and we don't get a lot of the details. We know the major actors, United States, Russia, China. He doesn't really explore that. What's happening in the novel is that these characters that we focus on in Australia, they're waiting for the radiation. It's slowly descending to the global south, and eventually they're going to confront it, and they can't survive it. The scientists have already shown there's no hope for survival, and there's not. Spoiler alert, there's really not. So the metaphor of this radiation slowly descending,
That's pretty bleak.
it's pretty bleak, but it's also like the book is kind of beautiful because he's asking the question, as time runs short, what
Yeah.
do you do? What kinds of things do you do? How do you fill your time? How do you make it meaningful? How do your priorities get rearranged? And so you watch all of these characters like really focusing on the kinds of things that they would want to be doing in their last moments. It's a beautiful meditation because we might not, you and I right now are not facing radiation, but time is always slipping away. And so the novel is an invitation to think about our lives in relationship to our own finitude, the fact
Sure.
that we'll die someday. So it feels like a book about nuclear holocaust, and it certainly is. But I find it a much more interesting existential meditation on like what is it that makes our lives worth living at all?
Right, that makes perfect sense. So it forces an existential examination of mortality and meaning of life, basically, in ways that most people are not thinking about when they're just trying to get their kids to school and make their coffee and do their work and whatnot. You know, most people don't typically confront these kinds of issues until they have to. they're faced with an illness or a disease, or one of their family or friends are, then it hits them, front and foremost of something that they need to pay attention to. But most of the time, most people are not thinking about that. And most of the time, most people don't really want to watch documentaries about death and dying and whatnot, but maybe they will pick up a post-apocalyptic novel or something where they can escape a little bit into another world that makes them think about these issues in ways that they normally don't. I think maybe you're sort of saying some of that.
I absolutely am. Following what you're saying, it makes me think that in some ways, the apocalyptic novel, it serves a surprisingly similar function as the Puritan minister in the sense that you go to service, the Puritans are going to listen to those sermons because the minister's the guy charged with reminding them,
Hmm.
look, you have other, you're farming, you have other responsibilities, but don't forget that we're part of a Bible commonwealth. We're an elect nation. We have this covenant that we have to fulfill. And if we don't do it, we're going to pay a heavy price. And I think similarly, this tradition of literature and film does a similar thing. It invites us to stop and maybe reconsider or consider for the first time, what is it that I want out of this life, given that I have a finite amount of time?
Yeah, I like that. So it really gives fiction and literature a real purpose for people other than just entertainment. It can entertain, but make people think in ways that maybe the church and religious activities did more so earlier on. And so it serves a very important function for people.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it feels a little less dogmatic. And there's nothing wrong with dogma, there's nothing wrong with the structure of organized religion in this sense, but thinking about what literature has to do and how it has to, sneak past all of our defenses to allow us to open up to what it's doing. I think it's really important in that particular way. My students, I have to say, like my students, when they take my classes, I think they're a little bit suspicious that, end of the world lit sounds a bit nerdy, a bit sort of strange, a bit like what are we doing here? And within a very short amount of time, I think they discovered just how hefty and meaningful and beautiful this tradition is and how it's asking all of the big questions.
Kevin, tell us a little bit about what the class looks like that you teach. I'd be kind of interested. You're talking about the students coming, being a little bit reluctant and just wondering what's going on. Tell us about what's a class like.
I think for you and me growing up, like apocalyptic lit, that would have been immediately, I would think of like The Stand by Stephen King or, stuff by Philip K. Dick. But I'm not entirely sure generations of readers now necessarily have a sense that there is this thing. So part of what my students have to adjust to is like there's a rich tradition of stories about the end of the world. And part of my design for the course is getting them to see that not only is this tradition intellectually really interesting, it's super fun. The class I teach starts with the book of Revelation. We read some of that early Puritan, a couple of Puritan sermons, some Puritan, The Day of Doom by Michael Wigglesworth. Like nobody's reading that anymore, but it's kind of an insane, awesome poem. And then we move into like the 19th century, some of the works I mentioned earlier, the Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne. And suddenly my students are getting excited by this because the stuff is like weird and fun and gruesome at times. And then we get to the Cold War, nuclear age. We read Harlan Ellison, A Boy and His Dog, or Isaac Asimov, Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut, which is just incredible. And
Hmm.
and they're really starting to see by this point, it's like they're really getting just how profound and interesting this tradition is. I sign The Watchmen or Watchmen by Alan Moore, which is a graphic novel. Moore is not American, so I kind of sneak them in because the apocalypse in that story happens in New York City, which is interesting. It originates there. A bunch of short fiction by Stephen King, Octavia Butler, Samuel Delany. We read Station 11. We read Parable of the Sower, World War Z. I assign a bunch of music. So there's like a great tradition of apocalyptic music, heavy metal,
Uh-huh.
bluegrass, early blues, psychedelic music, Prince,
Wow.
1999,
Yeah.
REM. We watch the pilot episodes to The Walking Dead, to The Last of Us. We watched 28 Days Later, which is the Danny Boyle.
Yep.
I think it's a masterpiece. So for me, it's great because I love teaching the material. It's just like endlessly generative of the kinds of conversations I want to have with students. But also, I think it really, to use a contagious metaphor, it like infects my students. And so a lot of my students report like after they read this stuff, they see the apocalypse literally everywhere. They can't get away from it. It's on social media, it's in political discourse, it's on this show and this movie, and it's all over the place. And I think they're grateful for that. They don't say that, with any frustration. It seems like they get really activated because I think that tradition for them goes from being like a weird idiosyncratic. I always tell my students, apocalyptic literature isn't a subgenre or a subcategory of American literature. American literature is apocalyptic literature. It is the oldest, and I think what the genre fiction, and if we think of genre fiction as like detective fiction or romance or science fiction, I think apocalyptic fiction is the foundational work of genre fiction. And to understand the tradition of apocalyptic fiction in the US in particular is to understand something really foundational about the American imagination and the American literary imagination. That strikes me as being really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, before I started reading your stuff and talking with you, I didn't really put two and two together about this apocalyptic tradition from the religious aspect and the puritanical teachings and the sermons and whatnot. But I really see how it grew out of that now and how
Yeah.
foundational it is. That's, yeah, really fascinating.
Can I say something? Just one final thing about the Puritans,
Yeah.
because nobody reads them anymore, and no, like I don't blame anybody for
Yeah,
not
it's
reading the
not
Puritans.
sexy reading to most
No,
people
it's
when they
not.
think about it.
Yeah, it's not sexy reading. And, a lot of it is a bit of a slog to get through, but this ends up being maybe the most controversial thing I say in my class about apocalypse. It's something I believe. I believe it's true. I think there's an overwhelming body of evidence to underscore this point. I'm not acknowledging, and I want to acknowledge that there is a rich tradition of indigenous people already in the New World, or what for them would just simply would have been the world. I'm really talking about the tradition of Anglo-European presence in the New World and the writing that emanates from that presence. But it's not just that Puritans wrote apocalyptic lit, and they did. It's that the very reason those English Puritans migrated from England to New England, or what would become New England, is because they deeply believed that they were part of an elect nation chosen by God to establish these Bible commonwealths in the New World, that they had a special covenant with God. And that covenant was part of a providentially designed universe. It was part of God's plan, providential history. And that history will come to an end. That's what the prophetic tradition is all about. It's, from the prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Testament, and then, what we have in the book of Revelation in the New Testament or the Christian Testament is all about the end of that history. And the Puritans the settlers that went from England to New England believed that history was coming to an end, that there was going to be Judgment Day, the second coming, all of these things that we know they believed in. And so the entire motivation for these English settlers to be in New England was apocalyptic.
Hmm.
It was this belief in the fulfillment of providential history. So when people talk about like the European settlement of America, why did the Puritans come? Oh, they came from religious liberty, or all the things that are said. They had zero interest in religious liberty. They were intolerant of other kinds of like religious practices that weren't specifically their own. They were here. They came to New England because they believed that history was moving inexorably and quite quickly towards an apocalyptic end, which is why they wrote it so incessantly. So, my conclusion is that the European presence in America doesn't happen in the same way if it's not for the apocalypse. The America itself is an apocalyptic idea. And it's been absolutely foundational to the way I think not just about the literary tradition, but why that kind of thinking has been so durable
Hmm.
over 400 years. I mean, certainly throughout Europe, there's a rich apocalyptic traditions in other nations in South America, different South American countries. I'm specifically talking about what makes, ugh, I don't want to sound exceptionalist, but there's something kind of unique about what happens in America and in the so-called New World because the entire enterprise is motivated by apocalyptic
Yeah.
thinking.
Well, Kevin, that's really fascinating. And, if what you're saying is true about the Puritans, and I'm not a historian, so I have, you're talking to somebody who knows very little about this subject, but I can see your point that if that's the case, that apocalyptic literature really would hold a very important place, especially for the writing and the history of America. And you had made that point earlier that post-apocalyptic literature even today stems from that. That is really an American thing. Not that you can't find it elsewhere, but there's a uniqueness to the American tradition and history there that comes from the Puritans coming to the continent when they did. And that's a really, really fascinating thesis, Kevin.
It's an interesting thesis to test with students, because I say something quite provocative early on and then we see how it goes and
Yeah.
whether or not they leave the class. It's not a battle, it's not a fight, an ideological fight I'm interested in having, but it is a way of saying and of underscoring why the apocalyptic tradition, the post-apocalyptic tradition, or even the pre-apocalyptic tradition. In many ways, the Puritans are sort of like pre-apocalypticists because they're talking about the event before it happens rather than after.
Yeah.
But it's a way of underscoring why this literary tradition for me is so rich and interesting and important because it is the story of a certain kind of development of a particular kind of Americanness that I find interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And speaking of the classroom, let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. And I'm wondering, I'm guessing you were teaching these courses during COVID or around that time. And COVID is sort of an interesting example of recent history in our world. I mean, we're still coping with wars, we're still coping with fears of nuclear annihilation. That's been going on for a long time, and most people just sort of like pretend that's not there and nothing ever really happens. And so they get desensitized to those things, I think, unless, of course, you're right in the middle of a war, which is tragic for anybody who's there. But the rest of the world mostly just tries to tune those things out for better or for worse psychologically. They couldn't tune COVID out. That
Mhm.
basically engulfed the entire planet, and the entire planet was in a state of fear, and people were very, very scared, and nobody knew exactly what was going to happen or how that was going to play out. What was that like for you with your students, how you were teaching this class, and how did that all integrate with what we're talking about here?
Oh, it was really surreal. I've been teaching a version of this course for a long time, but it was mostly speculative. It was, the apocalypse was mostly theoretical. It was
Right?
like, well, when I started teaching like at the University of Richmond in '07, '08, like we knew about climate change, we knew about global warming, but still we have such an amazing capacity to push that off into a space where we don't need to think about it. And I can tell you what happened with COVID and why it was especially surreal is that I was teaching a first year seminar. So these were all first year students at the university. This was in the spring of 2020. By January, February, the kind of conversation around COVID was changing and it's becoming more and more apparent that this was going to be a global pandemic. And my students went away on spring break. And the next book they were scheduled to read was actually Station 11. When they got back from spring break, we were going to read Station 11, which is about a flu pandemic. And, the next thing we all know, we're not returning to in-person learning. We're going to be going to online learning and making all these adjustments. And I had to, I mean, really had to make this decision. Am I going to assign this novel that's all about a flu pandemic that wipes out the globe,
Yeah.
when Americans, maybe some of the family members, the elder family members of my students could potentially
Yeah.
die, or what am I going to do about this? And what I decided was to teach the book. I think part of it was my long-standing belief that having literature to rely on is always a better thing than not having it. The other part of it was just kind of an experiment. What would it mean to read this book in this moment? So I wrote my student before we returned, and I said, look, the plan was Station 11. That is still the plan. Let me know if this doesn't sound like something you'll be able to do. I understand your fear because I'm feeling it as well. Everybody was game. By this point, we had a really good rapport. I think if it was earlier in the semester, it might have been harder. So we did it. We read Station 11, and then we continued with the semester all the way to the end, all apocalyptic lit, all kind of bleak, but also really life affirming, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the semester, many of my students either wrote to me or told me over Zoom. They said reading Station 11 was the most important thing they did all semester
Wow.
when they read it. And I said, why is that? Because I genuinely, I was relieved to hear that, but I also was a bit terrified that it was going to have like double down on the trauma. And a lot of said independently, they weren't in on this together, but my students were saying reading the literature actually gave us a little bit of distance to think about something that was actually happening right now. It mediated our thinking about the contemporary moment because we had to think about it through literature. So even though it was about a pandemic, and even though lots of people were sick in Station 11, they weren't living the reality of Station 11. They were living the reality of COVID. And so much of what Station 11 is about is enduring, finding ways to endure suffering and catastrophe, of like making life meaningful in the face of catastrophe. And that book was so perfectly poised to let them learn that lesson because it wasn't just about death and decay. It was about how we are able to make meaningful choices and establish and preserve meaningful relationships, even in the face of that suffering. And boy, it was a relief that they had that response,
Yeah.
but it also confirmed suspicions I've always had about rich literary traditions being the thing to sustain populations that suffer. Still surreal, still strange, but also really powerful for me as a teacher to have that experience.
Yeah. Well, I would think that Station 11 would be one of the better choices of post-apocalyptic literature under those circumstances because there is a lot of hope in that book and preservation of, the arts, of course, is a big part of that.
Mhm.
And the characters, if I'm remembering it, it's been a while since I've read it, there's not as much bleakness as you might see in some other stories. Of course, there is some, obviously, but I could see how that would be a good choice. And kind of like what we were talking about earlier about this idea of the ordinary, recognizing, like finding appreciation in the moments that you're living, realizing like things could completely change, where there is an end, there is a mortality, and those existential issues that arise are very helpful in that moment. And I could see how Station 11 would have helped them with that. I'm curious,
Mm.
when they were reading it and they were taking the class, this is a weird question, I suppose, but were people sort of imagining like this is the potential future that we might be facing and how would we face it if that happened? Or were they able to detach and pull back enough to sort of say, this is still fiction and we're imagining, and this is an imaginary future that makes us think about our own lives? It's kind of a weird question, Kevin, but I'm just
Um,
kind of curious.
it's a great question because they weren't able to explain it away as fiction, even if they wanted to, because I think the realities of 2020, I mean, it wasn't just COVID. I mean, it was COVID, but it was all of the political instability,
Yeah.
all of the misinformation, all of the divisiveness, all of the sense that it's one thing to suffer with a pandemic. It's another thing to feel like you're in a where the politics isn't there to provide and support, it's there to divide and destroy. And so the thing that the apocalyptic tradition does, it puts the reader or the watcher of the film in a particular relationship to time, and especially time running out. That's the mechanism. We all know we're going to die, but we imagine our death as being way, way, way into the future. And this is the way we can sort of go about our days without dread and anxiety. But the apocalyptic narratives like Station 11 make death more imminent, more real. And so it's against that frame of reference that we're forced to ask philosophical questions about how we want to spend our moments. What kind of society do we want to live in? What sort of moral perspective do we want to cultivate? And so my students were doing a version of that. They were like, oh my God, we live in a kind of nightmare moment where it's like there's a pathogen that we don't have a handle on, and there's a political class that's being completely irresponsible. However, they also took the cue from the novel that this is also an incredible opportunity to think about what kind of lives they would want to live, what kinds of communities they would want to be in. How are they going to make the most of their education? How are they going to for their parents? How are they going to preserve those bonds with their friends? And so watching them do that using only the novel as a kind of set of signposts. I mean, I wasn't able to say, here's what we need to do because I really had no idea as a teacher.
Sure.
But they took the cue of literature and they continued to do it throughout the rest of the semester. We read World War Z, which is a zombie novel. So zombies, it's about pathogens and infection, but that novel is all about what is the geopolitical response to a zombie outbreak? Well, we don't have to worry about zombies, but a geopolitical response to a crisis is an interesting question in the midst of COVID-19. So when they read World War Z, they did the same. Like, look at the way some nations are responding, some communities are responding, and look at the way others are failing to respond. Yeah, it was beautiful and illustrative of the way, with the right disposition, the literature can sustain deep explorations into really hard questions in really difficult moments, all at the same time. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, I do, and I agree, and that makes perfect sense what you're saying. And I'm thinking, like, really, for me, the best post-apocalyptic stories, the real struggle is psychologically, emotionally, interpersonally, what the people are going through who are enduring it. You take like The Walking Dead, for example, which for me is a brilliant series, but after you get over the initial dread of the zombies themselves, the series is all about different factions of people, whether they can trust each other, will they turn on each other, how do they relate to each other, how do they cope with dealing with life in a post apocalyptic zombie world where the most dangerous beings are other humans trying to get their needs met through survival, and what other kinds of basic human psychological and emotional needs they're struggling with. So that's where it really becomes interesting, I think.
Your take on The Walking Dead is exactly my take. It was, you said it kind of beautifully because yeah, after a few seasons, like the zombies, if that's all we're focused on, it doesn't remain very interesting. But I think you're right. Everything about that show and about the communities of people and Rick and the fact that he keeps his police uniform, these questions of law
Yeah.
and his relationship to it so rich. And your point about other human beings being the major threat to, well, you don't need zombies for
No.
that. That's simply being in the world. And so I think you're right. That show really brilliantly called attention to realities that we're grappling with anyway, but we can think about more deeply because of the urgency, because of the vulnerability of these characters that most of whom end up, like our favorite characters end up dying,
I
so
know. It's
it's
so
really
tragic.
tragic.
Yes. And they did a really good job probably resisting the urge to up the ante with the zombies, right? They could have started making smart zombies or
Right.
zombies with special powers or whatever. Mostly they didn't do that. They
Agreed.
focused on the dynamics of the humans, and I think that's what really kind of matters the most with how we're looking at post-apocalyptic fiction.
And the zombie too, it's just such an interesting metaphor. This is the kind of thing I would do in like a literature course is spend some time thinking about like why the zombie is interesting. Well, one is it's like quasi-human. It sort of looks like us, but it's also disfigured in a way. It's like us and not us. It's a malformed and grotesque version of the human.
Yeah.
And like what does the zombie do? Like it consumes, it eats. And so like my students and I will talk about the way consumption and capitalism are
Yeah.
oftentimes explored through the figure of the zombie. And so not every zombie narrative is about that, but there are great opportunities to think about the links the zombie has to all these other concerns that we're always thinking about.
Yeah, well, I wish I could be a student in your class, Kevin. I may come and audit it someday because it sounds really, really like you stimulate some fascinating conversations with your students. And on that note, give us your short list. What are your favorite novels or post-apocalyptic fiction that you would teach or you would recommend to people?
Oh boy, that is challenging. Station 11, I'll
Yeah.
start there. I love that book. I teach that book all the time. I think it's so teachable, which is partly why I love it, but I also love it because it expresses a vision of the world that I believe in a way, so it's also deeply personal. So I think Station 11 is an important one. I think The Stand by Stephen King. Do you know that book at all? Have you read it, Aaron?
No, I've heard about it. And in fact, I had another guest on from Aarhus University in Denmark who teaches post-apocalyptic fiction, which he's actually, I think he's writing a book about The Stand, or it may be about The
Wow.
Stand, another Stephen King book. And he was going on and on about it. So it's definitely on my list of things to read.
Well, it's a book that goes on and on. I mean, it's well over 1,000
Oh,
pages, and
wow. Okay.
it often shows up as in the short, like the top Stephen King novel. I don't think it's anywhere close to among his best novels, but within the apocalyptic literary tradition, it's pretty successful. So I think Station 11, I think The Stand is essential reading. I think The Road by Cormac McCarthy is
Yeah, that's
essential reading.
amazing. Yeah.
The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. These are more modern versions. Watchmen by Alan Moore. Usually, when I teach that course I talked about a little while ago, it's Watchmen. That's the one my students, it blows their mind. I mean, it truly rocks their world because they didn't realize, many of them who hadn't read it, and most haven't, what a graphic novel can be, how profound and moving a graphic novel can be.
Yeah.
But I also think in terms of earlier works, I think The Mask of the Red Death is just awesome by Edgar Allan Poe. It's so eerie and beautiful and visually so interesting. I'm a huge Kurt Vonnegut fan, so I think Cat's Cradle is great as well. Not everybody loves Kurt Vonnegut, and I understand why that's the case. But I think Cat's Cradle is like a great, this is
Yeah.
1963, I think, where he takes on science and religion, and he thinks about this moment where like the two great apocalyptic traditions have to do with religion and science after they split the atom. And I would say, I would encourage your listeners to have a peek at a Puritan sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. This is in the early to middle part of the 18th century. Great, like riveting, terrifying sermon. I would have them look at that. And then from, almost 100 years earlier in the middle part of in the 17th century, a poem called The Day of Doom by a guy named Michael Wigglesworth, a Puritan from Massachusetts named Michael Wigglesworth. And both of those people can get online PDFs. They're open source, easy to find. I wouldn't encourage anybody to read the entirety of The Day of Doom, but it'll at least give like a sense of what the Puritans were like. And, they're a complicated and quite varied community. I can't even refer to them as a community. I mean, it's like 150 years of a quite heterogeneous a set of traditions, but quite literary and deeply intellectual, very interesting. And some of those works will at least give a window into the Puritan mind that will then make the later traditions make sense. So that would be my short list, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Those sound like great recommendations, and I'll post those in
Yeah.
the show notes so people have
Oh, great.
a list that they can take a look at. Kevin, this has been really a fascinating conversation, and I love speaking with people. This is a psychology podcast, but
Mhm.
I love speaking with people in other departments and other academic fields and are doing other things because the cross-referencing of material and thought is always quite interesting and fascinating to me. So, kind of hearing your takes on apocalyptic literature and the post-apocalyptic literature and the origins of that has been really a fascinating conversation for me. tell me, do you have any final thoughts on this topic, anything about it that you'd like to leave us with today that you think might be important?
Yeah, I think so. I would like to leave your listeners with this point, and I think it stems from the experience I had teaching Station 11 with my students. If you have concerns about the world, anxieties about meaning, fears about the future, I wouldn't avoid the apocalyptic tradition. I would pursue it because I think the great thing we have in order to grapple with the contemporary moment is a long history of really smart, earnest, compassionate, and creative people also grappling with similar questions. And so to be rooted in those traditions means that we're not alone in our fears and anxieties. The great thing about apocalypse, which people I think can forget, is like there's lots of devastation and lots of destruction. But if you read the book of Revelation, there's a happy ending, a new heaven and a new earth. It's about regeneration, redemption. So much of the best apocalyptic work, it's bleak at times, but as a way of imagining something something beautiful and sustainable and humane and nourishing. And I would say the tradition can provide that for readers if we give it some time. That's what I would want to leave your listeners with, and it's something I want to leave my students with. I do. I'm going to turn this on you, though, if you'll let me. I wanted to ask you a question
Sure.
because you published a work of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic fiction, and a lot of these questions you've been asking me, I've also been wanting to ask you. So why this tradition? Why did you choose it? And what was it about it that allowed you to do what you do in your novel?
Well, thank you for the question. I appreciate that. Well, first of all, I really love post-apocalyptic fiction as a genre. I love that because it sort of gives us a blank slate to see how people react when all of the normal rules and conventions of civilization are removed. And I like that. And so in my novel, which is told from the first person perspective, by the way, the first person point of view, which I did
Hmm.
intentionally because I really wanted the reader to get into the mind of the protagonist character.
Hmm.
So the protagonist happens to be neurodivergent. He's on the spectrum. So because of that, already has his own angles and difficulties connecting on an emotional level with other people and with people around him. So that's already a challenge. We have this story where most of the world is wiped out by a virus. And by the way, I started writing this before COVID. People think that COVID probably inspired it, but it really didn't. But anyway, it was published obviously after COVID. I was really interested to sort of explore these ideas of loneliness and meaning around interpersonal dynamics and connection in a world where very few people were left. And I was especially interested in exploring that from the perspective of a person, a neurodivergent person who already had difficulties on the emotional level connecting with people. So what you get is his exploration of what it means to exist in a world where very few people are still there. So he meets characters along the way, and there's a plot and a storyline that's important to the story. But a lot of it is a mirror reflection of himself as he meets people and explores how people feel about the importance of connection and of loneliness and of what it means to exist when you're not around other people. And on a psychological level, that was important to me because in my psychotherapy practice, I deal with that regularly. People feeling lonely, people feeling disconnected, people feeling like they're struggling with sense of meaning and existential purpose. And so I was really pushing the boundaries with that with this story. Also, a big part of it is what happens to the human psyche and the mind when all the rules disappear and most of the people disappear. And so it's a real exploration of themes of mental illness and sort of fragmentation of the mind and mentation when those are removed. It's very psychological, Kevin, this story. It's very psychological, introspective. I'd consider it a bit of a slow burn. So people are expecting zombie killings and, just intense, high octane drama are not going to get that from my book. but people who are really interested in an exploration of what happens to a person and the way they relate to the world in a post-apocalyptic setting could really get into the mind of the protagonist.
Oh my gosh. It sounds unbelievable. I mean, I'm not aware because there's so much apocalyptic writing, but I don't know of another book. Maybe you do that's told from the perspective of a neurodivergent person. And this is why the tradition is so endlessly rich because that's like a fascinating, like the emotional dimensions and everything. But on top of that, the way in which you select a protagonist tied to your own work in the clinic. But do you know of others
I
along these
don't.
lines? Or
I don't,
yeah.
and nobody else I've spoken with does. But it's very important for this particular story, especially because he's sort of a mirror for all of the people that he meets, who are all really struggling and longing for connection and emotionally connecting with other people because they're so lonely. And he himself struggles so much with that to begin with because of the factors around his neurodivergence make that difficult for him.
Mhm.
So it really, I think, works as a way of getting at that idea.
Oh, wow. That's really exciting. I look forward to reading it, Aaron. Seriously. Sounds great.
Thanks, Kevin. Oh, I look forward to you telling me what you think about it, but go easy on me because you are an English professor and I'm not the greatest writer. I might have some good ideas, but like for somebody like you, I'm like, oh my God, sort of scared to hear your thoughts
No, no,
about
no,
it.
no. I'm my default setting is to affirm and to want the tradition to grow. And it sounds like you've made a contribution that's going to allow for that to happen. I'm really excited and quite happy for you.
Oh,
So
thanks so much. No, I
congratulations.
appreciate the question and thanks so much, Kevin. Well, this has been really a fascinating and enjoyable conversation. I've really enjoyed having you on the show, and hopefully we can stay in touch and hear more about what you have going on in the future. Hopefully there's not a new pandemic coming anytime soon that we'll have to be having another conversation about, but the work's important and thank you for doing it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to MindTricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about MindTricks, you can go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Be sure to subscribe to MindTricks on your preferred podcasting host to be notified of new episodes of MindTricks. Please take some time to give MindTricks a good rating and review wherever you are listening. It really helps get the word out to new listeners. And please like and share MindTricks posts on Twitter and Facebook by following your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.